Okay, welcome everyone to the Middle East Policy Forum. My name is Mona Atea. I'm the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies here at the George Washington University. And we're just delighted to have with us today Wes Morgan and Nilofar Sakhi to talk about Wes's new book, The Hardest Place, The American Military Adrift in Afghanistan's Pech Valley. Wes Morgan is a military affairs reporter who most recently covered the Pentagon for 2.5 years at Politico. He previously worked as a freelance journalist in DC, Iraq, and Afghanistan, contributing stories to the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and other publications. He's an alumnus of Princeton University and the author of The Hardest Place. Thanks so much, Wes, for joining us today. He will be in conversation with Dr. Nilofar Sakhi, who's professional lecturer in international affairs at the George Washington University. She's a scholar practitioner who's written extensively on various aspects of human and transnational security. She has extensive experience in managing international organizations and has been involved in assisting peace and counterinsurgency policy formation. And she's been involved in the Afghan peace process since 2010 and remains a regular commentator and writer on various aspects of peacemaking and peace building in Afghanistan. Just before I hand the floor over to Nilofar, I want to thank Rachel Schaefer, who's the Middle East Policy Forum assistant, for making this event possible with all of the logistical support. And the Middle East Policy Forum, of course, was established by Ambassador Skip Ghanim and is presented with the generous support of ExxonMobil. So thank you so much for joining us today. Nilofar, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mona, and thank you, Middle East Policy Forum, for organizing this event. And thank you so much, Wes, for allocating some time to discuss this brilliant book. I was actually discussing a few minutes earlier with the group here that I read this book twice, last year when it was released and also this year again. And I found it an extraordinary, comprehensive book about the war, United States war in Afghanistan, which is based on a brilliant empirical research. Every time when I read, it takes me to really to the context there, because it has covered extensive interviews with different stakeholders involved in the war, with the people there, and also with the military forces and all other agency folks there in Afghanistan. So this is really an outstanding read. And I don't know if I've shown you the book. This is the cover of the book, and I highly recommend for those who haven't read this, and if you who are interested in knowing more about the United States longest war, I think that is a brilliant read to go through it. The other aspect of this book is it is targeting, it covered the entire context, and the context in a very particular part of the country was a Pech Valley. And the Pech Valley, the terrain and the valley itself, the beauty of it, and it's a very so rugged and so sharp by its landscape, but again, it's considered one of the very it has a significant role in this entire book that we would like to hear more from Wes about it, and why actually he decided to go there, and he captured all the events from that particular place. So I don't want to talk more about it. There's a lot to talk about this, and of course Wes is there to unpack the entire book for us. But before everything, Wes, first of all, thank you so much for allocating your time. Second, if you just tell us something about your journey. What took you to Pech Valley, and that as a young freelancer that I went through your bio, what actually attracted you to go and capture the events there? It was considered one of the dangerous part of the country, and of course there has been constant U.S. involvement and U.S. military events there. But what actually took you there? If you could start with that, and discuss also about the nature of the data collection, how you collected data, and who you interviewed, and who were your direct interviewees during the process. So starting with your journey, and please take us through the data collection process throughout the book. Thank you.
Absolutely, Nilofar, and thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to this forum. So I first started going actually to Iraq before I went to Afghanistan as a very young freelancer. I started going to Iraq when I was 19 years old, and it was at the time the U.S. military offered what they called the embedding system, where reporters could kind of plug in with regular Army, Marine Corps military units and follow them around and report on what they were doing. And this was for a freelancer just kind of starting out in journalism. This was a really appealing thing to do because it was, you were covering important stuff, and also it was cheap. You paid for your insurance and your body armor and your plane ticket. But then once you were plugged in with the military, you just kind of were living on their outposts. So there was this, if you were a freelancer who doesn't have a lot of financial backing, it just was an easy way in. So I started, it was actually while I was in college, I started taking off my summers, and I took a year off in the middle to just go. And what I would do is I would typically take a trip first to Iraq, later to Afghanistan, of maybe about 3 months. And I would spend about 3 months bouncing around, spending a few weeks apiece with different US Army and Marine combat units fighting in different places in the war. I first went to Afghanistan and did this in 2009, in the spring of 2009, as kind of, Obama had just come into office and it was sort of escalating US involvement. The escalation was beginning. I came back a year later in the summer of 2010 for what was really the summer of President Obama's surge, where US force levels were, there had been about 30,000 US troops in the country when Obama took office. By the end of the summer of 2010, it was nearly 100,000. So he tripled the size of the US military mission in the country. And so what I wanted to see in the summer of 2010 was I just wanted to go to 4 or 5 battalions in 4 or 5 of the toughest fights in the country, and just see what it was like for those units in these tough places. It's something that was always interesting to me, both in Iraq, but then especially in Afghanistan, was how different the experiences of different units were as you moved from one part of the country to another. I remember this being especially true in the summer of 2010. I started out this summer in a district called Sangin in Helmand province, traveling with British Marines. It was a very flat area. There was not a lot of steep terrain or anything. And the fighting was all about dismounted patrols and IEDs. There was not a lot of gunfighting, not a lot of artillery. It was just these Royal Marines would walk out into the district and they would step on bombs. They would wait until they stepped on a bomb. And then I spent the course of the summer bouncing around to different battalions in different parts of the country. And in the course of that, one of the ones that I visited was a battalion of the 101st Airborne Division that was in the Pech Valley. And I didn't know a lot about the Pech Valley at the time. I knew that it was adjacent to the infamous Korengal Valley, which had been covered pretty extensively in Vanity Fair, in the New York Times Magazine, on TV. There had been a lot of stuff about the Korengal. It was sort of infamous. But U.S. forces had just pulled out of the Korengal in the spring of 2010. So I didn't really know what to expect in the Pech. And when I went there, I just was really struck by a few different things that I saw there that were different from what I saw elsewhere in the country, and had seen in Iraq as well. The first one was just the type of the fighting. It was long distance artillery duels, long distance gunfights. I just had never seen so much ordnance being expended, so many artillery shells being fired, so many bullets being fired, so many bombs being dropped, just all of the time on a daily basis. Probably all the other embeds that I ever did over the years in all the other parts of Iraq and Afghanistan combined, I never saw so many howitzer shells fired. So that was just striking, right? I mean, you arrive, you fly into this base, get off the helicopter, and right away you start, the ground is shaking because the howitzers at the base are just firing day and night, in support of the smaller outposts scattered throughout the valley. The second thing, it's a related thing, was the terrain. It's a very visually striking place. It looked not at all like anything else I'd seen anywhere else in Afghanistan. As Nilofar said, we're looking at very steep, jagged mountains. I mean, these are not sort of like long rolling slopes up to eventual peaks. These are, you see a lot of cliffs, you see a lot of very jagged, almost canyon or gorge-like valleys with very narrow, thin valley floors. And people lived kind of in two places. There are larger towns along the Pech Valley floor, which was where the road was. And people lived kind of along this narrow agricultural ribbon at the bottom of the valley. But then there were mountain communities also, much higher up, far, far away from the roads. And, what I learned is that, when you looked up from the valley floor, the slopes of the mountains looked kind of brown. But what was just out of sight, just beyond, kind of what you could see from down on the valley floor, is there are huge forests up in these mountains that I didn't see until later. And most U.S. troops either never saw or only saw it when they, the first time they were dropped off by helicopters on a clearance mission up in these forests. But we're talking about really enormous conifer trees, pines, cedars, firs, of the kind that you might see in the Pacific Northwest, or in northern Montana or Idaho or somewhere like that. It was just very different from anything else I had seen in Afghanistan. And it obviously had an effect on the tactical way that the war was being fought, because it gave insurgents, and I'll refer to them as Taliban here because at this point they were affiliated with the Taliban, but this was not really a Taliban insurgency in the first place. And I can get more into that later. But it gave them a lot of cover. It provided a lot of difficulty for U.S. drones and helicopters. And another thing that was really striking to me was, at the intensity of fighting at these little outposts, I remember visiting this place called Combat Outpost, Michigan, which was in the Pech Valley floor where the Korengal met the Pech. This place was just being attacked constantly. I mean, multiple times every day, they'd just be sucking down recoilless rifle rounds, RPGs, all kinds of stuff. No one could really, these outposts had been there for so long in 2010 that nobody could really tell you who lived at them how long they'd been there or why they'd been built. I'd ask the company commander, a young captain at Cup, Michigan, in charge of 150 American troops, who built this outpost and why? How long has it been here? And he'd say something to the effect of, well, it was here when the company commander before me got here. Pretty sure it was here when the company commander before him got here. Your guess is as good as mine. It's always been here. And so that was really striking to me that this was, even just 9 years into the U.S. effort in Afghanistan, a little less than 9 years, already things were kind of being lost in the mists of time because of the way the U.S. military rotated units on this 1 year rotation, or in some cases 6 month rotations. That after a couple of years in a place, nobody really understood what the original purpose had been. There was a purpose that they were there carrying out. But how far that had drifted from the original purpose of the outposts, no one knew, because no one knew what the original purpose was. And that kind of was just what fascinated me originally. Before I even had any thought of writing a book, I just wanted to know, okay, with these outposts in the Pech Valley floor, we're talking about a string of them from the mouth of the Pech is a city called Asadabad, which is the provincial capital, and there's a base there. And then there are 3 more bases running up, up along the river before you get to the Camp Blessing, which was the largest base in the valley, by the town of Nangalam, which is the largest town in the Pech Valley. I just wanted to know, how did each of these outposts get there? I mean, what was the story? So what I started to do was I just, I used the guys that I had met in the Pech, the American officers. I got them to tell me who the previous American officers they had replaced were. I found those guys, interviewed them, got them to tell me who they had replaced, and so on and so forth. Just sort of trying to rewind the tape to get to the backstory of when did each one of these little outposts get established and by whom. And what I learned is that basically there had been this parade of different arms of the U.S. government and the U.S. military that had all tried their hand in one time or another and in one way or another in the Pech and the more rugged tributary valleys surrounding it, like the Korengal and the Weigall. And it actually all goes back to the very opening months after 9/11, after the United States had intervened in Afghanistan, overthrown the Taliban. The initial air campaign really didn't touch Kunar or the Pech very much because there was not much of a Taliban presence up there. This is not sort of the Taliban, southern heartland. But what happened was when the United States failed to catch Osama bin Laden at Tora Bora in December of 2001, there was kind of a frenzy afterward among the CIA, the NSA, the Joint Special Operations Command, which has the Delta Force and Ranger and SEAL Team 6 commandos, to figure out where bin Laden had gone. And so what they started doing in the early months of 2002 was they just started sending little teams of JSOC operators and CIA officers, paramilitaries, out in every direction in the Afghan East, basically following any rumor that anybody had of places that Arab fighters had gone from Tora Bora. So there's this whole sort of network of little outposts that are built in the spring of 2002, which nobody thinks are going to be there for very long because they think, oh, well, we'll just use these to catch bin Laden and then we'll be on our way. But of course, every one of these bases actually winds up being essentially permanent because the war lasts so long. And the Pech is an example of this. U.S. Special Operations Forces came up to Kunar, established a little base at the mouth of the valley, near the mouth of the valley at Asadabad in the spring of 2002, started poking around all the little valleys in the area, asking about Arabs, asking about bin Laden, asking about Zawahiri. And we know in retrospect that, in fact, bin Laden and Zawahiri did stay in this part of the country, not in the Pech itself, but in a neighboring valley called the Shigal, for a period of months in 2002. So the CIA and JSOC, they were sniffing around in the right place, but they didn't pick up his trail. And I divide the book into kind of 4 quarters. The first quarter covers this early period, the early years when U.S. forces were kind of getting their feet under them in Kunar, trying to figure out what was going on. And really, they still saw their mission as trying to figure out where remnant al-Qaeda groups and figures like bin Laden had gone. It was during this period that it was a very small number of US troops that were up there. It was mostly special operations forces. And what you see during this period is these special operations forces, they wind up being sucked into conflicts, existing conflicts that they don't understand, and also inadvertently creating conflicts that they don't understand and sort of sparking resistance against them where originally there was not resistance against them. Sort of the typical formula is these Green Berets and CIA guys, they roll up into a district, they build an outpost. They typically, the CIA already has some relationship with some local warlord. A guy named Malik Zarin was kind of the CIA's biggest ally in Kunar province back in these early days of the war. And so he also became the US military's biggest ally. And then they rely on that local ally for pretty much everything. They rely on him to, give them manpower for kind of a local militia. They rely on him for intelligence. And this is where, things get really messy. Is because any faction that the United States allied itself with in this complex environment in Kunar would almost always wind up using the United States against other factions in various ways. And this might be just in terms of, funneling reconstruction funds to somebody on your side, or somebody from your extended family, or somebody from your tribal grouping, or it might be something much darker. It might be feeding false intelligence that, somebody that you have a business dispute with, or some other type of dispute with, who you want to see killed or detained. You can tell the Americans, oh, this guy housed bin Laden for a week after Tora Bora. And so off the Americans go and knock down his door and grab him and send him to Bagram. And this kind of stuff, it starts to build antipathy against the American presence, including among people who had opposed the Taliban pre-2001, which actually is a pretty substantial portion of the armed groups in Kunar. The main armed groups in Kunar were 2 political parties that are kind of leftovers from the jihad of the 1980s, Hizb Islami and a party called Jamaat. And they really, some people in these groups had opposed to the Taliban before 2001. Some had supported the Taliban kind of once the Taliban rolled in. But really, they united in a lot of ways against U.S. forces. I mean, there's sort of this trickle of members of these parties, old Mujahideen commanders, leaving the towns and going up to the hills and starting to fight this small, nascent American presence. And this period culminates in a real disaster that happens in the summer of 2005, where U.S. Navy SEALs are basically, they're looking for a fight, which is a phenomenon that was, pretty persistent throughout the war. Units get sent somewhere. It's not really clear to them what they're there for. They know they're supposed to be fighting, but they don't know who they're supposed to be fighting. And so this Navy SEAL element goes after a pretty small time local militant commander named Ahmad Shah, who is hiding up in the sort of the heights of the Korangal Valley, where the forest is really thick. And in the course of this mission called Operation Red Wings, the little Navy SEAL team is overrun, and one of the helicopters that comes to rescue them is shot down, and everybody aboard is killed. And so at this point, this kind of really changes the tenor of U.S. involvement up in this part of the country. Up until that point, not very many Americans had died in northeastern Afghanistan or in Afghanistan at all, in fact. Up until June 28th, 2005, only 69 Americans had died in Afghanistan. Then you add 19 to that number that afternoon, and suddenly it was a pretty serious loss, and it really kind of shakes the military into paying attention to this part of the country and starting to commit more and more troops to this part of the country. Increasingly not special operations forces, but regular infantry forces, first from the Marine Corps and then from the Army. What I describe in part 2 of the book is the period during which a succession of Army infantry battalions, so we're now talking about not little teams of 12 Green Berets or 40 Marines, but battalions of 600, 700, 800 young soldiers that fan out into the Pech and its tributary valleys, the Korangal and the Waigal, and they build this network of ever more remote outposts. And the reason that they do this is sort of the theory behind it is that they are doing counterterrorism through counterinsurgency. So that is, there's an overarching counterterrorism goal here, which is that the CIA still believes that this is a part of the country where there are things to be learned about Al-Qaeda, where there are Al-Qaeda operatives themselves, assisting the local Taliban, and where there potentially are sources who could be recruited who might shed light on where very senior Al-Qaeda leaders are in neighboring areas of Pakistan. So that's the counterterrorism kind of aspect of it. And the CIA encourages the conventional military to apply these counterinsurgency tactics that are becoming more and more popular in the US Army and Marine Corps at that time, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, toward this end. And what this entails is spreading out, building a lot of little outposts, basically on the theory that if you build an outpost near a community, and then you patrol around that community, and you help make it a place that the Afghan police and the Afghan army can also patrol, you'll kind of create a bubble or an ink blot, to use the terminology that Americans used in Vietnam, the Brits used in Malaya, French colonial troops used in Madagascar and Algeria. And that's really where this doctrine is inherited from. You create kind of a bubble of government control, and ideally of a bubble in which people are favorable toward the government because they see increased security and various benefits, and it kind of drives the insurgents out into the hinterland. So, they just start building all these bubbles, and they build them deeper and deeper up into valleys that really do not want them there. And really, in the case of the Korangal Valley, U.S. forces find themselves in this situation where they are on one side of a business dispute, and they don't know it, because by the time these conventional troops build their first outpost, the place that they build it is this sawmill. And what they don't understand is that the Green Berets who had poked their noses into the Korangal before them had already kind of managed to place themselves on one side of an unfolding conflict over timber, in particular over Himalayan cedar or deodar cedar. Which is it's a really nice wood for it's aromatic, it's rot resistant, it's bug resistant, and it kind of has this, it also has this sheen to it that had acquired in the 1980s during the jihad against the Soviets, where wealthy people in the Persian Gulf who wanted to support the jihad against the Soviets would buy Kunari timber, Kunari cedar in particular. And that would be sort of a way of helping to fund the resistance against the communists. But then this industry had persisted, and in the Korangal Valley in particular, Korangalis had started to become pretty wealthy off of this timber. But U.S. Special Forces had allied themselves with the Korangalis' business rivals. Sorry, there's a car honking outside. Not really anything I can do about it. But U.S. Special Forces had allied themselves with the business rivals of the Korangalis, and the Korangalis had in turn invited in the Taliban to help protect their own business interests. So you wind up in the Korangal with this situation where it's basically this local commercial dispute, but it becomes a much bigger conflict. Korangal becomes an arena in which these two outside groups, the Taliban and the United States, just go at it for years. And so part 2 of the book is about the succession of infantry battalions whose sort of grueling day-to-day lives were dominated by this type of fighting. Part 3 of the book covers, and kind of culminates in this, is a battle in the battle called the Battle of Wanch that happens in 2008. That's sort of the high watermark, where 9 Americans are killed in this battle. It's in a very remote place, and people high in the chain of command start raising questions after this battle, saying, "Wait, we're doing what out there? We're in how remote of a place that can only be reached by helicopter? What?" And so then part 3 of the book kind of describes from that point, from 2009 up into 2011 or so, or 2012, the disengagement, how U.S. forces sort of slowly extracted themselves from the situation that they had gotten themselves into, and the many missteps and foibles that occurred during that extraction. And then this is the period during when I first visited the Pech, is in 2010, when they've come out of the side valleys, they're down to the Pech proper, but nobody actually wants to come out of the Pech yet. It's seen as, nobody wants to admit defeat. The Afghan government doesn't want to give up the Pech because it contains district centers, and it also is where a road runs through that goes up to a provincial capital in Nuristan, which that the Afghan government is unwilling to kind of write off to Taliban control. But eventually the United States military, is convinced, decides, okay, that's enough. The Pech we've lost too many guys up there, over 100 by this point, 100 guys killed over the course of these years. And they withdraw. But the Afghan government does not withdraw. It leaves its Afghan army battalion behind in the Pech for the reasons I just described, that the Pech had this other importance to the Afghan government that the US military didn't really appreciate, or if it did understand, it didn't respect. And so this Afghan army unit is left out there on its own. It basically winds up on the verge of collapse because during all those years of fighting, US troops had not really invested in making this Afghan unit a sustainable thing. They dragged Afghan troops along as auxiliaries, kind of fought alongside them, but not really helped them prepare for the more difficult tasks of logistics, artillery, air support, these kinds of things that you're going to need to function on your own. So the near collapse of this Afghan army battalion just after the U.S. withdrawal in 2011 from the Valley actually draws the U.S. military right back in after just a few months away, and they kind of have to start from scratch in training it. They bring out a new ANA battalion, Afghan National Army Battalion, and sort of try to do it the right way this time. Instead of doing big air assaults up into the mountains, trying to kill as many Taliban as you can, which had been sort of the flavor of the day for a long time. It becomes, okay, let's not worry too much about the Taliban up in the mountains. Let's try and get this Afghan battalion on its feet, get it to a point where it can function on its own. And that's what part 3 of the book is about. And it ends with, essentially, you get this uneasy truce of sorts by 2014 or so between the Taliban and the government forces in the Pech, where the Taliban control the mountains and they control the side valleys. But the government controls the main valley and it controls the roads and the communities along the roads. And pretty much they leave each other alone. Every once in a while, the Taliban will storm a district center to make a point to show that they can. And then the government will surge a bunch of forces in and take it back to show that they can. But it's a fairly static stalemate situation between the government and the Taliban for a number of years, starting in 2013 or so. And then what part 4 of the book is about is sort of the counterterrorism aspect of what's going on during this period, the later years of US involvement in Afghanistan, where even though the Afghan government and the Taliban have kind of reached an uneasy accommodation, for the United States, this isn't good enough because the Taliban are hosting Al-Qaeda operatives, Al-Qaeda advisors, who do things like assist them with building IEDs, assist them with training. One figure in particular that the United States government was really worried about, named Farouk al-Qahtani, who was in the second half of the Obama administration was seen as a really serious external terrorism threat. So what the US military does is it resorts to a drone campaign, a pretty concerted series of airstrikes over a long period of time, over years, that they call Operation Haymaker. So without putting boots on the ground in the same way that they had in years past, which had cost them so many lives, they just do it all by air while the Afghan troops remain on the ground. This is it's a long effort. They eventually do kill Farouk al-Qahtani in the final weeks of the Obama administration. But then sort of the irony is by that time, there's a new actor on the scene as well, which is the Afghan branch of the Islamic State of ISIS, which kind of takes root in some of these same valleys. And really the reason is, some of these communities, very deeply conservative Salafi communities up in places like the Korangal, really were only ever allied with the Taliban out of convenience because they both were opposed to the United States. But then the ideology of the Islamic State for some of these hardliners up there actually seems more appealing than the Taliban did. So in the final years of US involvement, you have this bizarre situation where the US drone campaign is continuing up there, now targeting this branch of the Islamic State. And I think there's a great, kind of question to be had about to what degree were they targeting an international terrorist group versus to what degree were they simply targeting the same old Korangalis who just are there for their business interests, but who have raised the flag of the Islamic State. And they even kind of help the Taliban fight the Islamic State. In the final months before the Doha Agreement in 2020, you have this strange situation where even as the US government, the US military is pounding the Taliban everywhere else in the country with massive air campaign, up in Kunar, it's actually using its signals intelligence to listen in on the Taliban and figure out what the Taliban needs in its fight against the Islamic State. So it's sort of embracing the Taliban as a de facto counterterrorism surrogate force, even though the Taliban is not, doesn't necessarily know about this and or wouldn't characterize itself that way. But that's sort of where the situation, that's where US involvement in that part of the country ends. It really stops with the Doha Agreement. I talk a little in the epilogue about events since then, but that's sort of the story. I take it through 20 years of US involvement up there, up through when US involvement in that part of the country ends. Of course, it ends broadly in the rest of the country about a year later, in this past summer, August of 2021. And I'll leave it there. And I'd like to take questions.
Thank you. It has been a comprehensive explanation of all the 4 phases of the war that you explained in Pech. You also discuss about the role of CIA, and there were a couple of explanation and I think description in your book about what worked and what did not work in terms of the US military intervention. You referred to the lack of clarity about the mission, especially starting from 2002 during the first phase. It seemed that the first phase was more of an assessment phase of what was really happening and who are the threats there in that part. So I would like to know a little bit more whether that lack of clarity existed throughout those 4 phases or no, that evolved or that changed with the passage of time. And the second question about the second thing which actually got my attention is the role of CIA. In Afghanistan, it has been perceived and reported again and again that there has been lack of coordination among the different bodies and institutions, CIA, military, and all the other camps. So whether that has changed the mission, that lack of coordination, whether you want to use it as one of the failures of the US intervention and from logistic point of view, more tactical point of view, if it had any impact on that. And the last one, I think that you referred a lot in your book is about the fact that there was rotation, a lot of rotation happening, and most of the forces were forces from Iraq at some point. Were they executing the experiences from Iraq to Afghanistan? Was it a cut and paste model or no? They were trying to look at the context and develop strategies and mission based on the context where they were in. So if you can please a little bit reflect on all these 3 aspects, which takes us to the discussion of what worked well and what did not.
Sure, yeah, great questions. I'll start with the CIA one. In many ways, the United States was always fighting 3 different wars in Kunar and in many other parts of the country. The military conventional forces were fighting one war, sort of the daylight counterinsurgency war of going out and patrolling the villages and trying to get to know people and collecting intelligence. And then the CIA and the Joint Special Operations Command were fighting their own wars in the same places, but without really sharing too much information about it with the conventional forces. You see points where they coordinate well, but these points are usually fleeting. And sort of the norm over these many years really is of these different organizations shutting each other out, siloing information from one another, and only coordinating to the extent that they can get something from one another. You know, an example would be in 2006, the CIA encourages the Army's 10th Mountain Division to go and build all these outposts. It says, yeah, this will be great for us. This will help us collect intelligence. But then the CIA never really follows through on its end. You know, it never actually stations its own personnel up at these outposts. And eventually it becomes clear that these adjacent areas of Pakistan are not actually where bin Laden is. But this is never kind of communicated back to the conventional military, that part of the reason that they were there has now been, is now obsolete or has been proven to have been, false from the start. Another way that this manifests is the counterterrorism campaign that the JSOC and CIA guys are running, which really they're running their own two separate counterterrorism campaigns, and they're often stepping on one another's toes as well, is one of raids. I mean, they're going out in the night and they're grabbing people and they're taking them back to Bagram, and this creates endless problems for the conventional forces who have to live in that area and have to explain in the morning what has happened, often with very limited information themselves about what has happened. There was a while there in 2009, 2008, where the JSOC task force, the SEALs and the Rangers, it went by the code name Task Force 373. And the conventional troops in the Pech, there was one particularly, ugly raid where some of these Task Force 373 guys came in. They raided a house right by Combat Outpost Michigan in the Pech. And it's unclear afterward to the conventional troops whether the special operators got their guy or not, but they do know that they killed the old man who was the cook for the Afghan troops on this joint American and Afghan outpost. And there's just sort of this pall descends. The Afghan army troops are really angry about the raid. The American troops on the base kind of have to explain, like, well, yes, it was Americans, but it was a different kind of Americans. It wasn't us. We had nothing to do with it. And the joke afterward among the American infantrymen is that Task Force 373 stands for the 3 minutes it took these special operators to kill everybody in that house, the 7 months of sort of hard work of counterinsurgency by the regular infantrymen that this undid in terms of goodwill and people being willing to share intelligence, and the 3 years, pretty generously, that it's likely to take to, kind of fix this, to get things back to how they were before the raid. So that's really a very constant theme, I think, throughout the war. And there are points when it gets better. There's a period in basically 2010, 11, 12, when the conventional military and JSOC become much better at coordinating their operations, belatedly. And where JSOC kind of uses its forces to go after more the targets that the conventional guys want targeted. The CIA never really adjusts like that. The CIA always continues to do its own thing. And it kind of pops into view in the Pech Valley once in a while, and then it pops out of view. And it's really just something that conventional forces have to live with and deal with, and they don't have much control over, no control over, and limited visibility of. I think this gets also to, the first question you asked about sort of the clarity of the mission. I remember being in 2010 during my first visit to the Pech. I remember sitting with the battalion commander there in his office, a guy who's now a 2-star general out in Hawaii, kind of rising star in the Army. And I remember him saying, I sometimes, I don't know whether we're doing counterinsurgency or counterterrorism out here. Or is this nation building, or are we chasing terrorists? I read the same news that you do, and it's not clear to me. And I think that was very often the case. I chose the Pech to write the book about, in part because it's one of the few parts of the country where the counterterrorism mission against Al-Qaeda and ISIS is always in view. It's always visible there alongside the counterinsurgency war against the Taliban. For a lot of other parts of the country, if you talk to American troops who were down in Helmand or Kandahar, most of them went their entire rotations without ever hearing about the presence of an Al-Qaeda operative. So, I mean, I think the confusing thing, for US troops over the years is that basically the overarching strategy that the United States had was, we are doing nation building and counterinsurgency in this country for a counterterrorism aim. We are preventing it from once again becoming a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, the way it was when the Taliban controlled it before 9/11. So that's the counterterrorism aim. And yet for troops on the ground who are just fighting the Taliban and never see any evidence of Al-Qaeda, that just sort of can be hard to swallow. I mean, is it like we just have to fight here forever, and so long as we're fighting here, there won't be Al-Qaeda? Because sometimes there's evidence very much to the contrary of that the presence of US troops fighting actually draws in Al-Qaeda. And that's in fact what happens in the Pech. There were always small numbers of Al-Qaeda figures up in the Pech working with local insurgents, but the ferocity of the combat there eventually made it become a place that young Al-Qaeda operatives arriving in Pakistan would be sent to gain combat experience. So the U.S. presence in some ways draws both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda into this part of the country, and then even more ironically, the U.S. departure from the Pech in 2011 is what prompts Al-Qaeda to double down in the Pech and to send more people up there. As we know from bin Laden's, some of his later correspondence in late 2010 and early 2011 before he was killed, that the SEALs pulled off hard drives in his compound. Al-Qaeda viewed the mountains of the Pech as a potential backup sanctuary, because the U.S. military had burned itself out there and was going to be unwilling to take risks there anymore.
That's interesting. It's very related. Sorry to jump in the middle. Very related to your explanation here. So, what was significant about Pech? This constant engagement, going back and forth, and then changing the strategy, but still engage. The strong engagement, the U.S. military engagement. What was so significant about that?
I think a few things. I mean, the Pech in some ways is a very unique place. It has unique terrain, and it has the population is unique in a way that made it very, sort of uniquely difficult for the U.S. military and intelligence community to understand what was going on up there. And so both this, and I'll explain what I mean by that, but both the human factors and the physical factors of the terrain made this place a very, very appealing and increasingly appealing as the war went on for Al-Qaeda as a hideout. By the physical factors, I mean, up in the forest like that, there's very few landing zones, very few clearings where helicopters can land. That means that, if you're hiding out up there, you know exactly where helicopters are going to be landing. If they are going to be landing, you can keep people watching them all the time. The valleys are so narrow that you can hear helicopters coming miles out. The weather is terrible for large periods of the year, terrible in terms of flying up there, and there are a lot of factors that make it hard to do aerial surveillance up there. I mean, just that trees give off heat, for instance, and this makes it doubly difficult to kind of track people who are walking through the forest at night with drone cameras. By the human factors, what I mean is, everywhere the U.S. troops went in Afghanistan, they were dealing with two languages, right? They're dealing with Dari and Pashto. And they had a hard enough time with that, right? In negotiating those two languages, and having interpreters who spoke really good Dari, really good Pashto, and really good English. In the Pech, you need more, because people on the valley floor, their main language is an Eastern dialect of Pashto. The security forces often speak Dari. But then there are these smaller communities in the tributary valleys that speak other languages entirely as their first language. They likely speak Pashto as well, but the fact that they speak these other languages gives them this ability to communicate without Americans understanding. And an example would be, the Korangal has its own language, Korangali, which has no written form. It's not related to Pashto. And then in the mountains north of the Pech, there are 5 or 6 what we call in English Nuristani languages, but sometimes the Americans kind of think of it as, oh, this guy speaks Nuristani, but it's not. Nuristani is not a language. It's depending on how you count, 5 or 6 different languages that are mostly mutually unintelligible, and again have no written form and are only spoken in this one very narrow valley, or perhaps another side valley that's connected to it, where people have settled from. So finding interpreters who spoke those languages was extraordinarily difficult. I mean, so it's just sort of in the same way that the physical difficulties of Afghanistan are magnified in the Pech by the steepness of the mountains, by the presence of the thick forests. I think the kind of the human difficulties and the intelligence difficulties are also magnified because of the complexity of what the military would call the human terrain. And this works in favor of Al-Qaeda figures who are trying to hide up there, because they have a lot more time on their hands to, for instance, learn the local languages. There was an Al-Qaeda figure who spent about a decade post 9/11 helping organize the insurgency in Kunar and Nuristan and the Pech, who's actually Egyptian, but who had been living in Afghanistan for so long by 2001 that really he was, in many ways, he was perceived as Afghan, as a Pashtun. And he had wives and families, not only in Asadabad, the provincial capital, but in some of these side valleys, including the Wadapur, where people speak Wadapuri, or Gambiri. So there's just, small numbers of people on the run. We're able to make inroads in these valleys over the course of many years that American soldiers never had a chance of making.
Interesting. And going back to your explanation about the human factor, at some point at the end of your book, you discussed, I think you interviewed residents and former residents of the Pech Valley about the American legacy in Afghanistan. So what was the result of those interviews? What people's perception was about the US engagement in Afghanistan overall, and especially in their own valley?
Yeah, sure. I'll start by I think I kind of skipped a question earlier when you asked about the methods and who I interviewed, and this sort of helps set up the answer to this question. I initially interviewed Americans who fought in the Pech. That was where I started. Soldiers who fought there, commanders who fought there. From there, I kind of branched out. Eventually, what I became really interested in was how were these different units perceived by Afghans who worked with them? How does, say, a district governor in the Pech Valley, what did he think of the 6 different battalions that rotated through on his watch? Or what did an interpreter an Afghan interpreter who worked for 6 different battalions over the course of 6 years, what did he think of the different units? So I made later trips up there once the US military role had kind of wound down, both to visit the Afghan National Army troops and talk to them about what they were experiencing, but also to sit down with kind of local officials, local people of influence, and talk to them about their experience with Americans over the years. Often these conversations, I'd start them with kind of specifics. I'd want to know, okay, well, what do you remember about Colonel Ostland, or what do you remember about Colonel Cavoli, or what do you remember about this unit or that unit? But inevitably, they would kind of eventually lead to discussions about, well, what's the upshot, Ben? And the interviews that I closed that part of that last chapter of the book with, I'm talking to Waigali men. So from a village, from a valley that goes north from the Pech Valley. It's very remote, and in which sort of U.S. involvement had a very tragic start. U.S. involvement in the Waigal really began in 2003 with a botched CIA airstrike, where the CIA was misled by 2 of its sources into bombing the wrong compound, and killing a lot of the wrong people. And this error, which occurs in kind of one siloed war, the CIA war, winds up kind of lying in wait as a booby trap for the conventional 10th Mountain Division forces and their successors, who then have to hike up there and try to live there and make friends with people and do counterinsurgency. Waigalis who I talked to about sort of the broad strokes of the past 20 years, they would kind of divide it into these phases. There was the phase before the Americans were here on the ground, when they were doing airstrikes that killed the wrong people. Then there was the phase when the Americans were here on the ground, when they were, getting in firefights that killed the wrong people or killed the right people, but those right people happen to be your cousin or your brother or your uncle. And then the aftermath, when after U.S. forces had left and groups that really had not existed in the Waigal Valley before, like the Taliban and eventually the Islamic State, came in and took over and became the de facto government for years before 2021. So I think a lot of, some of the overwhelming impressions that I came away with from interviews with Waigalis in particular, but also with Kunaris and people from other parts of the Pech, was just this feeling of bitterness, of disappointment, of broken promises, that during the peak phase, when US troops were doing counterinsurgency and they had all these guys out there and they're spending all this money, there were a lot of promises made about infrastructure. We're going to build all this stuff for you: roads, schools, micro hydroelectric dams, police stations, gas stations, just all kinds of things. And kind of where this, many of these projects were never completed because they took longer than the U.S. military had. It eventually left before they were completed. And many others of them really just sort of fell apart fairly quickly, either just because the military overpromised and it was talking about building roads in places that it's not really possible to build a road, a concrete, asphalt paved road, or because the military did it badly. It subcontracted out to, to construction companies that then subcontracted to other construction companies that then subcontracted to other construction companies, who were all kind of, making a profit along the way, and then in the end deliver an inferior product that's going to have to be repaved every year. So then after the U.S. military leaves, it all falls apart and the road is terrible and it just feels like it's, a broken promise. I mean, there's one Waigali man who said something to me to the effect of, the Russians were godless and terrible and wrong about everything, but the roads that they built lasted, which I thought was kind of an interesting remark. And then this other impression is of, what is the American legacy here? Well, the American presence here brought in these outside groups that were not here before: Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State. Of course, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were in other parts of Afghanistan before, just not this part. But the Islamic State, that's an entirely new phenomenon in the later years of the war, that I think it's very easy to see how in the minds of people who lived there, who did not, who did not deal with the Taliban very much before 2001, and there was no Islamic State to deal with at all, can kind of feel like, well, this is what the Americans left for us, is these ruthless militant groups that, that now control our lives in a way that nobody controlled our lives before 9/11.
And just going back to your discussion about Al-Qaeda and Islamic State that you're referring throughout your book in some places, what was the composition of Al-Qaeda when you look at them, composition and their mission especially, or the same with Islamic State? You referred to some Arabs. Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. What is Al-Qaeda in this context? The way the military tended to define it was there are sort of core Al-Qaeda operatives who are typically Arabs, in some cases, Punjabi, Pakistanis, but they also would employ local Afghans as their sort of guides and scouts and facilitators. And where the line was kind of between Al-Qaeda operative and Taliban fighter could get fuzzy. I mean, there are people who are very clearly one or very clearly the other, right? Like, an outside Arab fighter from Saudi Arabia, who has pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda and is involved and does, corresponds with senior Al-Qaeda leaders back in Pakistan. That's an Al-Qaeda guy. A local Taliban member who has no connection to Al-Qaeda, that's a Taliban guy. But then you also have, Taliban members who act as the guides and facilitators to Al-Qaeda members and fight with them. So how the military really defined Al-Qaeda was always a little bit of an amorphous thing. But at its core, I mean, we're talking about small numbers of mostly Arabs who basically were doing two things up there. One, which was they demonstrably were doing, was they were acting as battlefield advisors to local insurgent groups, kind of in the same way that American Green Berets and other advisors were acting as battlefield advisors to Afghan government troops. They would help with things like, learning how to clean a heavy weapon, or learning how to assemble an IED with new components that have been brought in, or, how to avoid signals intelligence surveillance. So they would take them back to, to camps in Pakistan for further training and things like that. So that's one role that Al-Qaeda fighters were always playing up there. They also were just gaining combat experience themselves. I mean, this was a place that sort of new young Al-Qaeda guys would be sent to kind of sink or swim and learn what it's like to fight the Americans. And then the other main function, and the one that was always very hard to pin down evidence that was happening up there, was external attack plotting. Actually planning terrorist attacks to occur outside of Afghanistan. And the evidence that was happening was always very limited. It was probably at its peak in around 2015, 2016, when Farouk al-Qahtani was the Al-Qaeda emir for Eastern Afghanistan, and he was hiding out in the mountains north of the Pech. When the CIA and British intelligence, they had indications that he was bringing Pakistani nationals who were dual Pakistani British citizens, that Farouk was bringing them up there, training them for something, and sending them back to Pakistan. So that was a very worrying indicator. But it was never,
this was really in some ways always an assumption that the United States made, was that where there is Al-Qaeda, there is or could be plotting for external attacks. And then the question is, well, what level of kind of commitment of drones, of resources, what level of, what pace of strikes is appropriate to sort of try to keep a lid on that, even when you don't really have hard evidence of what's going on, given that you're never going to have hard evidence of what's going on. These are closed groups that the United States is not able to penetrate. And you're just never going to get inside really Farouk al-Qahtani's network, for instance.
Let me give a pause and see if there's any question, or if anybody has any question, and then I have a couple of other points to raise at the end with you. Is there any question from the group here? All right, seems not. All right, so going back to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, how serious you see the threat now? The threat of these two groups, especially plotting attacks against the West, going beyond Afghanistan, and also coordinating more with other transnational terrorist groups in the region. How do you see the threats from Afghanistan now, with the presence of these two groups being there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I don't really have much of an answer for, because I think so little is really known. I mean, since the fall of the government. I mean, what happened with the fall of the government, what also fell was the CIA's really its whole network of how it gathered intelligence in Afghanistan for the most part. There's still the ability to collect signals intelligence, I think, to some extent. You can still fly drones over the country and look at things, but what you don't have is a friendly paramilitary force on the ground out doing raids, capturing people, interrogating them, and that's really where the American intelligence about Al-Qaeda's role in Afghanistan was coming from, is my impression. There were these CIA-backed units that would go out and fight the Taliban, especially fight Taliban units that had Al-Qaeda advisors, capture them, take documents, interrogate them, and from that, draw conclusions about what Al-Qaeda is doing in the country. That's all gone now, right? Those units have disappeared. There is no combat like that that's occurring. The CIA director has testified that both Al-Qaeda and ISIS are some number of months or years, away from reconstituting an ability to attack outside the United States. I think the question with both, there's ability, there's intent, there's stated intent. With the Taliban, I think the big question with Al-Qaeda, the big question is, what does the Taliban let them do, right? And how controlled are they by the Taliban? How much visibility, how much control does the Taliban have over them, and what parts of the Taliban are sort of responsible for overseeing the Al-Qaeda presence? I think there are parts of the Taliban, and I'm by no means an expert in the Kandahari Taliban or in their the machinations inside the Taliban government before 9/11. But I mean, I think there are parts of the Southern Taliban leadership that are very, very wary of Al-Qaeda, and who are very mindful of the precedent that by sort of letting Al-Qaeda run around and do what it wanted before 2001, that allowed 9/11 and created the American international intervention that unseated the Taliban from power. On the other hand, there are members of the Haqqani family who hold very senior positions in the Taliban government, who appear to be who have long-standing, much friendlier, much deeper relationships with Al-Qaeda figures from the past 20 years. And among those guys, I mean, I think the relationship is probably much deeper now than it was 20 years ago. They have family ties that they developed. Al-Qaeda leaders have married Haqqani children. And so, so what kind of control or influence is the Taliban exerting on Al-Qaeda? What is it demanding of Al-Qaeda? What is Al-Qaeda nevertheless trying to do without the Taliban's knowledge? What are the Haqqanis doing without sharing it with other parts of the Taliban government? I think those are the big questions that I have really no visibility on. I'm fairly pessimistic about the extent to which the U.S. government has visibility on as well.
There's a relevant question in our chat box. Can you elaborate on the Pakistani military relationships with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups active in Afghanistan?
Sure. So the Pech is a little bit of an unusual place in that the insurgency there existed separate from Pakistani government support, but eventually was kind of co-opted by the bigger Taliban, and through that by Pakistani government support. So you don't really see kind of the direct hand of Pakistan so much, or at least I wasn't able to find evidence of it in in the war in the Pech. It's not like there were reports of ISI advisors being captured or killed or anything like that. But what you do see is, over time, as the Taliban itself kind of takes control of, hijacks the native Pech insurgency, you see more and more Pakistani fighters, mostly Pakistani Pashtun fighters, who are, who wind up being sent into Kunar and the Pech, to get their combat action badge, to learn what it's like to fight the Americans, this kind of thing. And that's, I don't have a much better answer for it than that. I mean, I think there are other parts of Afghanistan where, if you look down at the, the P2K region, Paktika host, and the fight that American troops had down there, who were actually right up on the border, units that were down there had a much more visible and direct experience of what the Pakistani military's role and the ISI's role was in supporting in supporting the Taliban, facilitating the Taliban. So if I'd written a book about that area, I think I'd probably have a much better answer. But in the Pech, which is a little farther in from the border, you just don't see it as much, not in the direct way that you see in the South.
Thank you. Mona, do we have time for one or two more questions or no?
I think just one more, Nilofar, if that's okay.
Yeah, okay, all right. So the last question is, again, it's from our audience. Can you comment on the role of women, the American military also among women, role of women? Okay. Oh. Do you see in the chat box?
Yeah, I'm looking at it. 1 second.
Military, American military also among women, indigenous population in Kunar. It's by Mom.
I'm not quite sure what the question is asking, but I'll try to address. I'm
not sure how the question is framed. Okay.
Yes, so but I mean, there were female American troops who fought up in the Pech. Not very many of them, because these were infantry battalions that were doing the bulk of the fighting. And it wasn't until 2016, long after the Pech experience had really ended for the conventional army, that women started to be integrated into the infantry. But there was, there were women medics who worked as part of these infantry battalions. There were, women mechanics, women riggers, women in other roles, women intelligence officers who supported these infantry battalions and would go in and out on convoys. There was a woman named Wakuna Jackson who was killed in the Korangal. She was the only American woman, American military woman killed in the Pech during these years of fighting, and she was a very young medic, attached to an infantry unit. By the end, there were what they called female engagement teams, where it would be a few women from a support unit who would get attached to an infantry battalion for the specific purpose of kind of helping to interact with Afghan women, do searches at checkpoints and stuff like that. I interviewed a few members of those female engagement teams. They really only, in the Pech, they only really showed up at a later point where the U.S. was not out doing the day-to-day counterinsurgency operations anymore. So again, it's like, if you were to look at the war in Kandahar, I think you would find much more evidence of an important role played by female engagement teams and their special operations counterpart, the cultural support teams. But I didn't see that much of it up in the Pech. I mean, certainly there were key women who worked in roles for the State Department and for USAID and for the CIA, who played roles in the war in Kunar. And then, the role of women among the indigenous population in Kunar, I'm not quite sure what he's asking. I mean, they're certainly there. I saw more of them than I would see in many other, sort of more heavily Pashtun areas of Eastern Afghanistan. I see he's added something about, absolutely, yeah, attack helicopter pilots for sure. I mean, there's a famous story. American forces would get to know the voices of Apache pilots and Kiowa pilots, that they talked to over the radio. And sometimes it would be kind of a running joke of, it's like comforting to have a female voice on the other end of the phone, and it's the Apache pilot who's doing the airstrikes. So yeah, women certainly played a role, flying air support up there. I think that maybe gets to what he was asking about.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for a very comprehensive read on this, on the entire context and situation in Pech. And I think I don't know how much it can be generalized across the country and different other contexts in Afghanistan. But I think I found it extraordinary, a comprehensive capture of the war in Pech Valley. Thank you so much, Wes, for your time, and thank you for presenting this outstanding book with all of us today. I give back to you, Mona.
Thank you, Nilofar. So just thank you, Wes. Thank you, Nilofar, for a really, really interesting conversation today. And thank you all for joining us. This is actually the last Middle East Policy Forum event for this academic year, but please join us again in the fall when we'll resume programming. So I put a link in the chat for the book, and the event is recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel. And Rachel will send it out to everybody who RSVP'd. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks to everybody in the audience for attending.